Okay, I'd like to call the Budget Committee for April 8th to order. Roll call, Jack is missing. Phil Ensign and myself, Mark Hessler, are here. Agenda approval.
Motion to approve the agenda.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
No public comments, I don't believe. And that takes us to item number 5, which I believe, Steve, you're going to lead into with the budget update.
Yes, thank you, Mark. So I'm going to start by opening up the file that's called Budget Status Report 2020-2021. So I'll pull that up on the screen and I'll make it large so we can see it. Can everybody see that on your end?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the last section of this report and see if I can make it a little bit easier to read. Okay. So this is what you receive in your board book on a monthly basis when we put the financial reports in there for your review. And what I really wanted to highlight is the building and department budget balances, which will be a part of the discussion for the next agenda item. And really the topic around this is, in a normal year, we have a practice of allowing the buildings and the departments to carry over the full amount of their remaining budgetary funds to be able to be used in a future fiscal year. Last year, we modified that approach. So the budget committee made a recommendation that any funds that were remaining in building and department budgets due to activities that did not take place because of the school closure would come back to, I'll call it, central office use for district-wide priorities. So the budget committee made that recommendation. Our office worked with each of the buildings and the departments to determine what those amounts were for them. And then those funds were not allowed to be carried over at the building department level. So this year we have a similar situation, but the dollar amounts are even larger. So when we get into the next agenda item, I just want to make sure that you're referencing this attachment, which we'll come back to, that's going to kind of drive that discussion. So I'll just hold off until we go to the next agenda item, but that's why we have this included. So you can see exactly where we are as of right now. Do you?
Steve?
Yep.
So when you look at that, let's just use Prairie School as an example. They have a 1920 carryover at $20,930.
Yep.
And they have funds available of $26,448 on the other end of the spreadsheet.
Yep.
Does that funds available include the carryover, or is that in addition to the carryover?
That would include it.
All right.
So their carryover would be increasing from 20,000 to 26,000 if we allowed them to carry all funds remaining. And given where we are in the year, most schools and departments have spent the majority of their funds.
Yeah.
So really that column to the far right and the column to the far left are probably the ones that would make sense to look at. And really the conversation of the next agenda item is, what do you as a committee feel is appropriate for this school year, given obviously the unique nature of it? Do you feel that they should be allowed to carry over the total amount of money in the funds available column? Do you feel like we should do what we did last year, which was ask them to identify activities that did not take place due to closure, or something else, which is just another idea is you could say the 2020-21 balance, which is in the column to the left of the funds available column, would be coming back to the district. So it's a variety of options, and I just wanted to call your attention to this report, and then we will bounce back to this at the next agenda item. Okay,
Uh,
all right, so I'll just go back to the other attachment that we have in there for this agenda item. Oop, kicked me all the way back out. Let's go in this way. Okay, so the first attachment is a document that comes from Forecast 5, which is a product that we purchased. And one of the features of this program is the ability to project the end of the year balance. So last year, I would provide this report to the committee on a monthly basis towards the end of the year, so we could start seeing where it looks like we were going to be at. This report includes both the general and special education funds combined together. If you go to the far right column, you can see what this report is identifying for both revenues and expenditures, kind of projecting it out through the remaining of the fiscal year. This report goes through February 28th of 2021. The next report that we can share with you through the end of March will be significantly more accurate. We're working on right now putting budget revisions into the financial system. Diane's working on some and I'm working on some. So we will be able to have a much more accurate report as of the end of March 31st. But there is one topic that I wanted to bring back up to everyone's attention. So if we go all the way back to August, I had put together a document that included a range of financial options that we could look at to address COVID-19 expenditures. Of course, the largest one was the operational referendum, which passed. But the second largest one that I threw on the table was to not make the district's annual contribution into our Fund 73 Employee Benefit Trust Fund. So part of the reason why this report shows a larger than you might expect balance projection for the end of this year is we haven't made that payment. And Mark, if you remember back in December, after we knew the operational referendum passed, I came to the budget committee and said, okay, what would you like to do now that we know the operational referendum is passed? The committee weighed in on things like moving HVAC and plumbing costs into the referendum, moving the additional virtual teachers at the elementary school into the referendum. But the one thing the committee said, let's hold off on in December, was let's hold off on deciding what we're going to do with the Fund 73 deposit for the year. So I just want to get that back front and center for you and just get you thinking about it. I think it makes sense to let us show you a more updated report as of March 31st at the next committee meeting, and then get your feedback about what your thoughts are regarding making that annual payment, or whether you feel like we should continue to hold at this point. We are legally allowed to wait until the end of July. But my preference would be not to wait to the last minute to do something like this.
Hey, what's
So
the value of that?
I'm sorry, what was that, Mark?
What's the cost of that payback?
Oh, sure. Yep. Let me open up a tab on the district website real quick, and I will bring that up. So I'm going to go and grab the referendum approved version of our budget from last fall. And nope, that version only has the changes from the referendum. I'm going to grab this one. And I'm going to go down to Fund 73. So here's the Fund 73 20. If you look at the 2020, 2021 column, if you look at the revenues into Fund 73, the 416,189 would be a payment the district would be making into the HRA contribution. So that happens anyways, but it's the line here, the line above where I have the mouse, where we would pay $587,108 into our Fund 73 trust fund that right now we have not made. So you can see this column has been reflected to be zero until we had a further discussion on the topic. So it's a little bit under 600,000 mark.
Got it.
Be the expected employer contribution this year if we did make it. So there's no action required tonight. I just wanted to get this back in front of you. My recommendation is to wait for us to be able to get you this report through the end of March, to get the budget columns updated, to get the expenditures updated, and then to have a discussion at the next committee meeting over what your thought process is. And of course, since back in August, when I put that information out there, we didn't know about ESSER funds number 2 and ESSER funds number 3. So we do have additional resources available to us that we didn't know at the time. Ideally, we would make the payment into Fund 73 because we still have an unfunded liability as long as we felt that we could afford to do it this year. Any questions or comments about this agenda item?
Makes sense to me.
Okay, so I'm gonna jump back to the next agenda item. So discussion on building and department carryover funds. So I mentioned a little bit of the background when I showed you the budget report that shows where all the buildings and departments are at. I guess I'm just looking for feedback on the committee is kind of just your overall thought process on what we should be doing with this topic of carryover funds. And I think probably like a really good example, it probably does not make sense to allow the athletic department to carry over that full amount of money from one year to the next when many of the activities were canceled or modified this year. So there probably is some merit to the committee considering pulling back funds at some level for central office, use at a district-wide level. But it would take feedback from the budget committee to say, we want to make a change this year so that we could communicate it out. And like I mentioned, the options are do what we've always done in the past, which is they carry over the full amount. Look at what we did last year, which was ask them to give back any funds for activities that did not take place. Or an example on the other extreme would be to recapture all of the remaining building and department funds to come back for district use. So it could be anywhere within that range. And we're just looking for your feedback on initially on kind of what you'd be thinking about that for this year.
Steve, can I ask something historically?
Sure.
All right. So let's just say athletic department or English department, I don't care which, had $10,000 unspent balance. In the past, they were allowed to keep it. I know when I was coaching, your budget, you either spent it or you lost it.
Yep.
And I didn't like that concept. It seemed like sometimes you were buying things you didn't need to buy just so you didn't lose it.
Yep.
But in terms of if you were allowed to keep it, what effect did that have on next year's allocation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So just a little bit of the history on it. For many of my years in Waunakee, it was, spend it or lose it.
Yeah.
And the budget committee became frustrated with requests coming from the buildings and departments for big ticket items Examples of that Randy and I would see quite regularly, we just use this example, was pianos. So we would get all these requests for like replacement pianos. The budget committee started saying the buildings and departments need to plan for these things, but we need to let them carry their money over. So they don't feel like they have to use it or lose it. So it might have been like 7 years ago, the budget committee said, no, we're going to change the practice here and they can carry over the full amount of what's left.
Yeah.
They get that plus their next year allocation. So it ends up adding to whatever funds they have available coming in the next year. So as an example, if the athletic department was allowed to carry over that full budgetary amount, that would then be added to their allocation for 2020, 2021 for their new balance. Now, the expectation from the budget committee at the time that we did this was that, if the high school needed a new piano, they were not going to send a request through to the budget committee to use contingency funds for a new piano. They were going to plan for it with the carryover funds that were available. I think the thing that was unique about 1920, when the budget committee took a look at this and said, well, if they were going to play, let's just say, a particular sport, and 5 away games were canceled, and the transportation budget had $5,000 left in it, why would we want that to carry over for just things that were closed? So it just depends on your perspective on whether you think they should be allowed to carry it all over, carry none of it over, or just like what we did last year, which was kind of a middle of the road approach, which is we asked the buildings to turn back over funds for activities that just did not take place.
John, you have a thought?
When I look at the high school amount, it is so high.
Yep.
What's in there that they would need that much money that they didn't spend?
So the high school has some pretty large expenditures that come through at the end of the fiscal year. Those are related to coursework that occurs at like UW Oshkosh for the advanced French program. And then the bills from like Madison College or UW Madison for students who choose courses outside of our district. So those bills are coming and they're generally pretty significant. So the high school balance, so I'll just point out this line here. They started with a carryover of $64,000, which is pretty significant. And if I go to the right, you can see that that would go all the way to 434,000.
Yeah.
But you have to take into account that their large bills for options at the above the high school level have not been paid yet. We did just get the bill for Oshkosh, and that's being reviewed right now at the high school and with Tim Schell. And so that's a pretty significant invoice. And then the other ones we don't have yet. So it'll come down quite a bit, but it's still going to be a significant number at the high school level when it's all said and done. And if you look at the athletic department line right below, they had a carryover of 11,000. And if you go all the way to the right,
Right.
that right now is slated at 61,000. So my recommendation is that those amounts are too high and that it would be definitely appropriate for the budget committee to take the same action from last year, which would be to return funds for activities that did not take place. Or if you feel like these dollar amounts in this 1920 column are appropriate, you could go further along the spectrum and say this was a very, very unique year and everything remaining in the 2021 balance is going to come back to the district. It just depends on your perspective on what you believe the building and department balances should really be.
As I looked at it, thought I had was, given the expenses we did incur this year through COVID, and we're gonna have additional going forward, I'd like to maintain much of the concept of what we did last year, with the exception of this. And I don't know how you make it work out, but the middle school, for example, they talked about all their furniture is one specific type, which kind of makes spacing an issue. And so if they have resources for that, might be a transitional expense they could cover to make some adjustments. Then rather than turn the money in and then requesting it back through some kind of grant portion, it would seem to make sense if they were going to use some of that money for transitioning for enhancements into the next opening by things we've learned, then let them keep it. If they, but otherwise, I would say if that's not the plan, then the central office would collect what they're not, what they haven't spent.
Yeah, what I would add to that, Mark, and I'm just gonna pick on the high school for a second. I mean, Steve, you and I have a request from the band department as they start looking at like some of their larger instruments that we just haven't replaced over time. It's a significant dollar amount to buy a tuba.
Right.
Do we utilize some of these dollars on some of these one-time expenses so we don't have to find it in the future? Or hinder the high school's future balance by having to have these large outlets.
So I think that would make sense if it's a long-term, it's
Right.
been a long-term project, it's, that's in the works, that sort of thing, or transitional cost. Those, I'd hate to collect it and then say, okay, now put in your petitions, we'll redo it. That's clumsy, but if they already have a plan, you guys work it out, what they can keep that way, and the things that haven't been used, then we
think
do
to
collect.
me, and Steve, you can weigh in on this too, because we kind of see where everything's starting to fall out with the larger budget for the year. As long as we feel we're comfortable there, we walk through these, we have an initial role of, if you didn't expend it, return it to the central office or to the general fund. But also having the conversation, are there things that are one-time expenses that don't have an ongoing cost to them? That we could utilize some of these funds to help move that part of their program forward. And I'm using the band piece because I know like
Yep.
tubas, baritones, basses, all those are expensive and there's a need for some of them to get replaced.
I do like the idea of individually having a discussion with each of those administrators and working jointly with them for expenses. But yeah, if they don't have a big need and they can't justify carrying over a bigger balance, I do think it should come back.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is a general recommendation would be to reach out to the administrative staff that manages each of these building and department funds, have them identify what some of their long-term expenditures would be, that they would be looking for some of the funds to carry over. But if we hear back from, let's just say, Arboretum saying the 26,000 that we had in 1920 is all that we need, we don't have anything at the front burner, then we would recapture those funds for district use. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yeah.
And would you as a committee like to see something that we could summarize at like the next meeting as far as what each
Yeah,
building and
helpful.
department would have planned?
I think so.
Mhm.
And I
Okay,
didn't, even with the athletics, it's a lot of money, but 2 years ago, there was discussion about needs for scoreboards and some of the other facilities, and I don't know if that's ever been done, because the budgets were limited. And so that would cover the cost of some of that, that, again, replacement items to me, that'd be money, why collect them? Let them use it for that purpose.
Okay, sounds good. Anything that anybody else has in this item? If not, I will go back to the full meeting. Okay, so the next agenda item is an update on the operational referendum funds. So the first report was included in the board book when we released it earlier this week. The second one, which I'm going to open up, is more current. And what we did with the second one is we moved the pay, that's too big. We moved the payroll for the teachers that we added into the virtual, the 2 FTEs. We moved their costs into the referendum. That was something we needed to work on. So now you can see in the lower right-hand corner, I'll try to get this a little bit bigger. The number 271,580.74 is what remains as of the end of March in the operational referendum funds. The most significant outstanding item is the Fund 50 Food Service Fund deficit. So if you can remember, way back in the fall, the Food Service Department presented a plan with options for moving forward during the school closure. The budget committee weighed in on those options and selected one of them, which that option had a deficit cost associated with it. And it just continued to be a deficit cost as we moved month by month through the fall. Having students back for the remainder of the school year will turn the negative balances into some positive months. So that's the good news. But it's possible the food service negative balance could approach $200,000 for the year. And just as a reminder to the committee, last year during the school closure discussion, the board voted to continue payments to both Taher and Lamers for their staff, like we did for district staff. And that resulted in us using up our fund balance in Fund 50, meaning any deficit that takes place in the food service fund, Wisconsin state law requires the general fund to reimburse the food service fund for any negative balance. So when you see the 271, we just need to keep in the back of our mind that whatever the food service fund ends up losing this year has to be paid back. And if you go all the way back to when we were explaining to the public the need for the operational referendum funds, food service was always in the top 5 of the list. If you go back and look and how did we describe this to the public, the food service deficit was always described as one of the main uses of the operational referendum funds. It's just we won't know what that deficit is until we can get through the school year. I just wanted to call your attention to that still is out there. What we didn't know about when we were looking at the operational referendum funds is the only funds available for COVID was what the federal government would end up doing for districts. The first grant was called ESSER 1. That was pretty small. That was about 62,000. We use that for technology for students. The second one is called ESSER 2. I know Diane has shared with you that initially that number was very large for our district, about 1.7 million. Then the Joint Finance Committee removed the DPI's recommended approach and is now going to be distributing the majority of that money based on in-person hours of instruction. So we will not know how much we're going to receive from ESSER 2 until we can see what that looks like with in-person hours. And then we also now have ESSER 3, where the DPI has sent a proposal again to the Joint Finance Committee on how to spend ESSER 3. There are school districts advocating for going back to an approach where it's based on a per pupil amount, not based on hours of instruction. But it remains to be seen if the Joint Finance Committee ends up doing the same thing with ESSER 3 funds. The bottom line, though, is we are going to have additional federal funds beyond what we knew we were going to have. So we're not limited to $271,000 by any means for COVID-related expenditures. It's just our best approach is to use the food service that we advertise to the public as a use out of the referendum funds to come out of the referendum funds. And then other things that come up, we should look at lining up with the additional federal funds that are going to be coming in.
Steve, the number reflected in that column, 271 and change,
Yep.
you said it included the additional staff we hired for remote.
Yes. Yep.
So, do we assume their entire salary has been calculated out of that, or will there still be salary taken from that to cover those two teachers for the next 3 months?
We encumber those expenses in the column to the
Okay,
left.
so that's in the other one. Okay.
Yep. Yep. So we still have 274,000 that we haven't spent, but it's reserved for things like salaries or
Yep.
probably some of the maintenance work that we maybe haven't been billed on. And then the column to the right would mean 271,000 really not committed to anything at this point, with the exception of just making sure everybody understands that that food service piece is still hanging out there.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, anything else with this one, or do you feel we're in a good spot?
Looks good.
Okay. So I'm gonna go into 20, 21, 22 then, if you're okay with that.
You bet.
And the first thing I'm gonna do is just bring up the timeline. And there's only two things I want to point out on here. April 29th is the scheduled special board meeting, leadership team meeting to review the 2021-22 budget process. So just wanted to call your attention to that. That's a night where in the past we have typically provided, let's just say, a presentation with some background information. This year, we'd be including some background information on what's in the state budget. What does that mean for our district? What additional funds do we know about from the federal government, et cetera? So there's some background information given. And then we typically try to break up into groups to really receive feedback on the budget planning process from groups that get together. We normally prepare a prompt question for them, then give, let's say, 10 minutes worth of time, and then each area reports back. So I'm just looking for feedback from the committee. Do you feel like that has worked well in the past, or would you like to see us think about doing something different this year on April 29th? Or Randy, did you have anything that you wanted to add about doing some things differently that night?
You and I talked about that, Steve, and I think that's generally what we were trying to do, is trying to use it as more of a workshop type setting. The question, we just don't know right now, are we going to do it via Zoom or in person in some way? And that's kind of dependent on location and then kind of commitments to be able to record meetings. But that would be a larger group that I would, if we were going to do it in person, and you probably could, because I think the majority of our, all of our staff would have had the opportunity, and
It would be, I think it'd be more productive face to face.
so it would be an opportunity. We could do something in a larger venue, but that's generally the concept you and I talked about, Steve, was trying to do some pieces that were again, sharing kind of the high level information and then looking at some pieces for dialogue for planning moving forward.
Sounds good to me.
Joan and Mark, as board members, is there anything in particular that you would like to ask for those in attendance that night to be able to provide their feedback on, whether it would be, you know, kind of a major topic like moving pay increases to the spring? Another major topic would be looking at budget requests. Is there anything in particular that you think, you know, based on your discussions with staff, that you would like to see us prompt for a discussion?
I would like to look at some of those budget requests and, you know, from the individuals who are requesting them, you know, the impact. How often have they come to the board with those requests and have not had them met? You know, maybe some history. You know, I had a listening session tonight, and again, the request for additional pathway time, additional tech support at the elementary. I know they're on the list. Have they been there 1 year, 5 years? You know, I think some of that information, some of the history behind
Yeah.
those requests are important.
And to piggyback on that, it's getting reflective. We've seen a number of long-term programmatic goals
Yeah,
on this list year after year after year. And then there's new ones added to it as well. How long has, I think the idea, how long has this been a want, need item? And where's it, how do they view the priority now compared to some of the other needs? Would be helpful.
Sure.
Okay. Give you a piece, because some of the departments that have put forth, if you remember a year ago, I think it was a year and a half ago, we had them kind of do a long-term vision.
yes.
Yeah.
So you have a number of things on the list, but they all weren't your one priority.
Right,
They were kind of a staging piece. So trying to understand kind of the order of preference. And
Yes.
if that's shifted. And I
That
think
would be
the other
helpful.
piece that would be good for here is we've laid out priorities, which will go in front of the board on Monday, of which some of those are kind of targeted at us coming out of COVID and trying to look at things like intervention and some of those pieces. Are there opportunities that we can move some of those forward? And then how do we pay them? And that's kind of the question that I think would be good for us to discuss. There's money there. It's just a matter of how do you make sure that it's continual money and not the one time? And if you do spend it as a one time, having a plan for how you're going to get back to where it's a continual.
Well, as an example, in the last year plus, we've hired additional health support and social worker support.
Right.
And yet some of those were long-term high priorities.
Right.
But now that that's hired, does that come off their list? There's something else there, you know, so
And
anything like that would be
it will be
helpful.
able to facilitate that, sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
That gives us a good piece that's gonna be kind of on the front piece that we could share, pull out some of those things that are kind of the primary priorities, I guess.
Yep.
And we can share those and then that can be part of our discussion. I like that idea.
Okay, great. So I'm going to move on to the next agenda item, discussion of class sizes and FTE changes. So typically, when I would put together a budget planning process document, I would focus in on class sizes, enrollment projections, and estimated staffing changes for the next fiscal year. So I want to just run a couple of things by you so you can see what that's looking like. I'm just going to go to the pages that have that information and provide a little bit of an update for you based on discussions at the intermediate school. So we're planning for enrollment based on the 2021-2022 numbers on the right-hand side of this page. The total that we're at this point estimating is an increase in 10 students from where we were in 2020, 2021. again, what we're seeing as far as, issues related to growth is you can see the large classes that are sitting there in the high school. This year's senior class of 339 residents and 14 open enrollment in. When you move up to like looking at where we're at with like kindergarten enrollments, like you can just have your eyes see where we're at in the high school, and then your eyes can go see where we're at the early grades in the elementary. We're graduating more students than are joining us in the early grades, and we need growth throughout the system to even maintain an even status for enrollment. So if we don't have new students enroll throughout the rest of the grade levels, we actually would be a declining enrollment district. Because when you're replacing 339 residents with projected 4K coming in at 226 and kindergarten at 258, we're already down over 75 students with just the transition from 12th grade and the new group coming in. And then typically we've seen growth throughout our grade levels. Many of our classes have been increased by 10 students or more. But what happened this past fall is we didn't see that growth. So because we didn't see that growth, our enrollment actually declined. If you look at this chart, you might say, boy, we're still only going to be up 10 students next year. It's not really that it's only up 10 students. We're needing to see 75 students moving in on all of the other grade levels to just match the number of seniors that are graduating. So while this doesn't look great from a total student count perspective, it ends up having a very significant impact on revenues. Because even so far as 5-6 years ago, we were seeing differences of 75 to 100 students per year. That has continued to come down as we've been seeing those larger senior classes graduate and smaller, elementary class sizes coming in. So we are planning for staffing around the right-hand column here. So this is where the information comes in about class size. Does anybody have any questions on that?
Just a question looking back, and I apologize if it's distracting, but from the 64 that we lost last year, did we ever do an analysis to see where the greatest number of those came from, whether they were high school, elementary, or is it just across the board?
It was kind of across the board. We also had a little bit of a hard time trying to track who we lost, and then we also gained kids.
Okay.
So you had kids that you lost to potentially like a private school or
Right.
online, then you had kids coming back in.
Okay.
So when I worked with Julie to try to get a good sense of what that is, it was hard to get any sort of a trend that showed
Right.
where it was. It was kind of across the board, and it was a mix of decisions that people made. And then you had individuals coming back at different times. And then you had move-ins and kids leaving based on just regular movement that you have within families. So all of those things is kind of made it a little bit difficult to really track that specific. But I think what you did for these numbers was you tried to repopulate back if our students all returned, and then figuring in a bit of a growth factor. That's how you got these numbers.
Yep.
Yep.
So then one thing I just want to call your attention to, so you can see the movement from one grade to another. So the intermediate school has a large class here in 6th grade. We added 2 teachers into 6th grade because of that large class size. That large group is moving into 7th grade next year. So we're going to talk a little bit about FTE, and I think the easiest example to kind of talk through is the 5th and 6th grade. So you can see 5th and 6th grade returns to very consistent numbers between both of those grades next year. And that then impacts staffing, which I will show you on this screen. The update that we've had since we put this together is we're recommending 14 sections in 5th grade, which is what is currently there. 14 sections in 6th grade, which is currently 16. So those 2 FTE in effect would travel with that large class size to the middle school. Amy Johnson has been working on this with the intermediate school staff, and Randy's been talking to the middle school administrative staff as well. But in effect, we would be keeping the FTEs that we added in 6th grade this year, but transitioning the 2 positions to the middle school to really follow the students, basically. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that, Randy?
Yeah, and what we took a look at was, let's just look at the 5th grade, 318 students, we go down to 14 students in a class, that's 22.7 in a class. So it still is a very, it's a lower class size than we've had in a while there, we've been pushing the maximums, and it still gives us a lot of room for growth. So, and that's really what you're seeing precipitate out here. When you saw those budget projections, and particularly those projections that where we were adopting like the DPI model, if you remember that a few meetings ago, that was based off of a cast forward of all of our sections remaining the same. This is really built off of a piece of, we don't need as many sections, and it still has a positive impact on reducing our class sizes. So if you take a look at like 1st grade, you're down to 20-to-1 ratios with 1 section less. Those have been pushing 22, 23 across the board for a number of years. So this is a piece, and that's part of what we're talking about. It's not that there's going to be anybody reduced from contracts. It's through attrition that you'd be able to move people. And then, as Steve said, that intermediate school numbers would then follow and transfer up to the middle school. Talking to Mike Zabella and Jeff Keenest, I mean, one of their limiting factors is space. So like, where would you put teachers? And they felt that they would be able to figure out that puzzle, but they felt it was important to have the staff. So obviously that would mean they have to do some sharing of rooms, but it was more of a concern to them of not having the staff and trying to work with the space piece. The other piece that we are tracking behind on, usually when you see this report, we have a little bit stronger numbers because we've already gone through our shared staffing, which means we all sit around and we take a look at how we're going to utilize our staff, where our numbers are, and particularly around our encore staff and how we're sharing. With all the other planning for reopening, we haven't done that yet. So that still needs to occur within the next month before we bring the budget to the board in May. But from our conversations with Steve, Brian, and I, if you recall, we added quite a bit of encore staff in the last couple of years to accommodate for growth. And we actually were overstaffed in many places anticipating further growth. So I don't anticipate us needing to really do much with encore staff and shared staff. It's going to be more of managing our regular ed sections. And then as we start to look at that as a final budget number, if we're comfortable with these, it kind of plays into that salary and budget items piece. I guess the piece from an initial look is when you look at our class sizes, they look much better than what you've seen in previous years at this point when we brought them forward. It does give us some latitude potentially with some additional dollars to make some decisions on. That's kind of what I said.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Randy said. So the numbers you see here in this column, they look much better than we've been typically bringing forward during this process, because the numbers to the right are what's called the class size optimum, not the maximum. And so you can see that we're basically right at that number. And we have typically been to the maximums. We've K through 2, we've gone to 22, 3 through 6, the maximum was up to 25. So even with the reductions here at first, second, and fourth, we are still at levels that we have typically not presented in a budget document like this. So it's a positive situation. Brian has shared that there is enough retirements and resignations that each of those 3 section reductions will not result in anyone losing a position or being laid off. So this document does not result in any Waunakee teachers not having a contract for next year. It is all manageable within retirements and resignations. But we just wanted to see if you had any feedback over this document before we begin moving forward with planning around these number of sections for each of these grades.
Yes. So on the next page, it appears like most of the reduction, it looks like most of the reduction is coming from Prairie.
Yep.
So I don't understand unless we have flexibility with where our kids go, that we ideally end up with those 20s.
Yep.
Because if you go back to the kids at Prairie, and I did the math, if I take the kindergarten kids and the number of sections and reduce it by 1, first grade is at 22, second grade is at 23 1/4. If you're going to take them all out of Prairie, we're not going to get the numbers that you just showed me.
Right. So the one thing to keep in mind is that the numbers for enrollment include hypothetical growth. So they're not actually students that in total that we know are actually going to be there. And what Julie Gangler does with all new students who come into the district is analyze their attendance area versus class size. So we are making that decision on a regular basis when students move in. But yes, the reason for that at Prairie is Heritage. If we go down and you look at the bottom with the total number of teaching staff, Heritage is actually becoming a larger school than Prairie. With the enrollments that are occurring because of the new development in Kilkenny Farms, the Heritage attendance area is actually resulting in more elementary students than the Prairie one. And yes, the numbers that you see here are averages across all 3 elementaries. It's not each particular school, but it is an average. And when you look at the reduction in sections, it's primarily driven from the number of sections going from one grade level to the next one. And then looking at, as an example, there's an extra teacher in Prairie at first grade compared to the number of sections that would move forward to stay within the board's class size policy.
You're gonna see in 4th grade, your number's 19.6. That's because we kept an additional teacher at Heritage in the 4th grade.
Yep.
So there were some of those based on just student need, that as the principals took a look at it, there was a request to try to accommodate some of that. But to your point, Joan, you're right, that's an average of your students and your staff, but it doesn't mean every single, there is some balancing out there where you're gonna have some highs and lows.
And because of that, if we're gonna look through an equity lens, how do we respond to the parents at one school where you might have 20 first graders in a classroom and another where you have 19? And that's a huge concern from my perspective.
I guess the question would be then, and that would be a piece that I think we kind of, like I said, we're still a little behind in this process. That's got to come out yet. Is if you would like us to go back and take a look at that from a respect of what we project actual numbers per grade level per school and try to balance them as much, if that's kind of an objective, versus trying to have kind of an average across the district. And we can certainly try it. We can do that.
I would really like to do that, but I have one other just throw out there as an idea. We're coming off of an extremely challenging year where a lot of people in our community are concerned about the academic level that their child may or may not have obtained because of the situation. Can we keep more of these teachers and these primary grades lower for the next year, with the understanding that we will look at it after we go through a whole regular year, keep those grades low and target some of that money for that one-time fund of our referendum? We have that referendum money again next year.
Right, so when you take a look at, when you look at those early budget projections we shared, those were based off of, they didn't have these reductions in there. They were with
Okay.
just being fully staffed.
Okay,
So if you want us to go back and try and take a look at how do we drive class sizes lower for the reason that you're looking at, we can certainly do that, because that's what our initial projection is. Then we also then have to have a conversation on kind of some of the, you're looking at further intervention or any other things that we require, how we fund those long term. We're gonna have short term money.
Yes,
We just need to see how then, we have to have a plan for how we do that longer term.
right.
So
Right.
part of what the budget committee would like us to look at, we can go back and take a look at these and kind of break these into, not make some of those reductions and see where it makes sense to strategically put them to balance out class sizes and make them smaller across the district. That's something we can certainly take a look at.
well, and there's the third thought is, and we won't know this for some time, is what impact whatever remote model we have in the fall
Right.
would have on reducing these numbers
Right.
as well. And
But then that would take staff too.
right, it would, yeah, take staff, just the numbers may be lower, I don't know.
And that's part of the piece that's not, that we have talked
And we're not gonna
about.
be ready for.
We don't have a hard number
Right,
on some of those
right.
things. But that would be a piece that you may have, let's say you had enough first graders across, you would have one teacher take those students.
Right.
So that's a piece that we're in the process of also.
Yeah.
So, no, that's good feedback, let us. take
So,
that and-
You know, when you go back to page 4 in this document and you have it all broken out by building and average pupil.
Yep.
That to me is so much more valuable than seeing like page 5, when you include all staff and you give me a historical staffing ratio. You know.
So you're looking for the page 4 data for
Yeah.
21-22.
Yeah, I would love
Okay.
that.
All right.
Absolutely.
And,
So
and can you also, when you look at the middle school and the high school, you have lumped in every staff member with the total students. And I get that's how some people calculate that. But, you know, in reality, it would be nice to know what our average number of kids sitting in a core class looks like. You know, if it's a regular classroom teacher divided into the total students, so we get I'd like a better sense of, you know, how many grades are we running at 30, 35, you know, and maybe they're not that high anymore, but it would be so much more valuable to me to see those ratio of student to teacher depicted by actual classroom teachers instead of all the specials in the building.
Okay, got it. We can certainly do that. Question for the committee then. So the reductions, if we look at that in the sections, would have been covered by retirements and resignations. Do you want to see Brian post those jobs pending another review of this at the next budget committee meeting, or do you want to see those held?
That's a good question. When are we meeting again?
We definitely need to meet before the May board meeting. Ideally the week before the May board meeting, so it would be in about 3 weeks.
Is this something that should go to the whole board to review? Or do you just want feedback from this committee?
It's however you would prefer it. If one of you wants to bring this up under the budget committee meeting and see if there's further feedback, that's fine. But I mean, one of the things Brian could do is post, anticipated openings, and he could collect applications, and that time would then coincide with our additional review. And you could decide if you want to hire those positions, we'd be ready to go. I think we'd probably be concerned with waiting to post
Yeah,
jobs
I
until
agree.
May.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Why don't we go ahead and do that?
Post them.
Because I don't have to hire for a position, but we could post it for that as an anticipated piece to get that out there, get it rolling, and then we can articulate that
So,
as we move it up.
Point of clarification, we're talking posting replacement positions plus the 2.69.
2.69 is kind of a mathematical number, Steve. We have to go through shared staffing to figure out what that is.
Yes, yep.
So the posted number refers to replacement staff.
It's really.
To those
Right.
It's kind of the
elementary.
Elementary ones, right?
Okay, yeah,
Yeah, the 269 is not a real number. It's kind of a projected number by a mathematical.
I don't see how we can not start advertising, given the
Yeah.
market.
Yep.
It'd be
agreed,
unfair to our
agreed.
system.
Right. So what we'll do is we'll get those posted as a anticipated, and we'll go back through and show you what this would look like if we don't reduce those sections, and then how we could balance those. It may require people to switch grade levels or other things, but we look at it from a viewpoint of balancing class sizes on an equitable level across the district. Is that how you would kind of articulate it? I think that's what I heard from Mark.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. All right. we can-
Okay, perfect. That's the type of feedback we were looking for, so appreciate that.
Steve, can you go to page 7 before we go forward?
Absolutely. Page 7, you got it, right there. Yep.
Maybe I've got the wrong page.
What's that?
I think I have the wrong page.
Oh, okay.
The head count?
No. Go to page 8. There, that's what I was concerned about.
Yeah, so what this is it's
Financial
a-
impact of this full picture. It looks like from over the next 5 years, our deficit doubles almost every year.
Right, so what we're looking at here is over the short term, our revenues through the revenue limit formula are going to be scaling back. The reason is our enrollment growth is projected to, on this slide, you can see the percentage change on the enrollment,
Yep,
only 10, 5, 9, 13. A lot of this is why Randy's been working with Mark Roffers to really get an accurate view of what's happening in the community. When you look at this, this is just math on the head count. This calculation does not know about new subdivisions,
sure.
like the subdivision occurring, over by Culvers. So Mark is going to be presenting information as to the growth that we should be expecting to see in the community. I think we probably all would agree that what we see on this screen is very unlikely to occur, and that we're much more likely to continue growing as a school district over time. just due to the total volume of new housing developments that are there. And so basically you take this model that has very limited change in student enrollment. When you plug that into the state's revenue cap formula, it just looks bad.
Okay,
But I think in general, we would expect that we will probably be seeing an increasing enrollment occurring again with the number of developments that are occurring. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that right now. Plus, the board has the ability in each one of these years to make decisions regarding FTE, class sizes, staffing, pay increases, health insurance, all of it. And we would certainly be focused on a balanced budget as we move forward. But it looks like the red is there really connected to the student enrollment and not really having much growth planned over the next 5 years. And that's really the reason for engaging Mark Roffers again.
What I've asked Mark to do is to do really a first of two reviews. This first review is connecting in with all the developers to see what's changed. He met with us like in the fall before COVID was when he really updated his whole report. What I've asked him now is say, okay, you made assumptions in that whole report. How has that changed over the last year? And how are those projections moving forward? So that's the first piece. And then the second piece is a little bit harder for him, but a piece that he and I agreed we would look at and review after he did the first phase, which is how do we update enrollment projection? The problem is you really don't know a hard number for fall yet. And that's going to be, you're kind of building off of a trend.
Right.
You got this big blip, but you don't know what the next trend is going to be. So we're
So-
starting off at the growth of the developments first, to see how that's trending.
has he ever, or does it even make sense to do this? When Steve, you're looking at this year's number of seniors, the next year's number of seniors to first graders. We ever done a historical? Where was this year's senior group when they were in first grade?
Yeah,
To
we
see,
have
to see
that.
the average growth
Yeah,
per class?
we do have that.
We do
I've
have that,
got that
okay.
in my office on a spreadsheet. Tim's got a different one.
Yeah.
The challenge we have is I think we'll continue to see that, but we did.
It's just not consistent.
And now we've got to see kind of what's going to take to build back where we were, and are we going to build back at the same trajectory? Now, when I look at like the Viridian development, there's a lot of houses going up.
And
And
that,
multifamily.
that
Maybe
new
look at-
one, just right down
on that
Arboretum.
road, right.
Uh,
So
There's
those
like,
there's
4
homes
new
gonna be going in.
basements.
Yeah.
So how will those be then? Those are the questions that I've asked Mark to really take a look at as an official wash of this.
Okay.
And I'll have him come to a board meeting in here.
Okay, thank you.
perfect.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else on this agenda item, or I'll jump into the next one?
I think I'm good.
Mark, you good?
We're good.
Okay, so the next agenda item, obviously Jack is not here tonight, and he did not see the presentation that Brian put together for the HR committee. Joan and Mark, you've both already seen it.
Yep.
So that's why we said we didn't need Brian jumping into the meeting tonight, because
Perfect.
we didn't feel like we needed to do that again, because we were intending to do it for Jack.
Yep,
But since he's not here, we can just ask Jack and Brian to connect.
sure.
Yeah.
So Brian
Okay.
can share that information. Are you
Good
okay
idea.
if we just move on to the next topic?
Please
Yes.
do.
Okay. The next topic, I just wanted to pull up this file and just share with you what it is. So Diane prepared this document. So she worked with the budget committee at the last meeting to put together some budget planning parameters. This document just captures the recommendations from the budget committee at last month's meeting as far as how to plan. So I just wanted you to see this. This is just referencing the last month's budget committee discussion. when you decided how we were going to move forward with planning for this year, and just wanted to make sure that this is still our current thinking and we just can move forward with the first draft of the budget planning surrounding this. I think it's the important thing to always keep in mind when you're in a state budget year is all we can really do at this point in time is just do our best to estimate the resources we think will be available. It's certainly possible the dollar amount could be higher. As you know, the governor has proposed more resources for schools than what you see on this document, or it could be lower if through the legislative process, it ends up being revised to a lower figure. Pretty much we're taking, I would call it kind of a middle of the road approach, where we're not overestimating the amount of revenues. We're basically not putting into our process what the governor's asking for because we're not sure it's going to be that much. But we're also not at the other end of thinking that it's going to be a much lower number. I would describe it as a very reasonable planning process. But I just wanted to bring this back just to make sure you could see it and see if you had any questions about it. But this basically reflects your discussion from last month. Any feedback or questions or concerns about this?
Not at this time until I mean, I
Jared's
think,
got some work to do.
right, I think Brian might have some, projected increases in some of the other categories, but
Yep.
we're not there yet.
Okay. So then, thank you for the next topic is it's just kind of, I just wanted to bounce this off of you. So we are currently providing food service through the Waunakee School District for both Madison Country Day School and the Village of Waunakee Senior Dining Program. Both of those programs are within our district boundaries. Westside Christian School is actually in the Middleton Cross Plains School District. They're outside of our boundaries, but they're within 5 miles of our boundary. And what that means is we have to provide parent-paid transportation for any Waunakee students who attend Westside Christian. So even though they're outside of our boundaries, we still are responsible for transportation for our students to get to that school through their parents. Madison Country Day School is so excited about the food service program that we put in place for them. They've been recommending Taher to some other schools that are struggling a bit with their existing programs. And so Madison Country Day School recommended to Westside Christian School that that Waunakee provide their food service. The advantage of doing this is that we have a bit of a profit that goes towards the Waunakee School District bottom line. But what I really wanted to get your feedback on is philosophically, do we want to even be getting into the business of contracting food service outside of our district boundaries? And if so, where would you see it stopping at? So if we get more requests, what do we do with those? But basically, I'm just looking for your feedback on, are you comfortable or uncomfortable with us providing food service arrangements, outside of the Waunakee School District boundaries?
Steve, my question to you on this is it cost efficient? I mean, I saw there was a projected nearly $20,000 net revenue from the operations. But is the work that it entails worthy of that amount of money? And there are some fundraisers that you put more time in than it's really worth getting them what you did. And so
Right.
that'd be if it's an efficient use of resources, then I'd say why not?
Yeah, Randy and I had, email communications with Connie Vaco about it because we wanted, number one, to make sure that our program for our students would not be compromised in any manner,
Yep.
which she assured us we would not see that. And we did not see that with the addition of the Madison Country Day School. Connie is a very financially cognizant director and is very uncomfortable with the fact that we don't have a food service balance anymore and that we've had deficits during, the school closure period. And she's really driven to try to get the financial picture improved for Fund 50. So she's definitely looking at this as an opportunity, Mark, to capture that roughly 20,000
Yeah,
to help the Waunakee School District program. I would be supportive of this, but I just wanted to make sure that the school board was comfortable of us for the first time really offering this service outside of our district boundaries. If you're comfortable with it, Connie Vaco believes that this will be a nice opportunity to improve our Fund 50 finances without compromising our program at all.
I'm in favor of it.
I don't see any problem. I think Connie is amazing.
Yeah,
Randy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I agree with everything you said there, Steve. I mean, our only concern was, can we do it without compromising anything that we're already
Exactly.
offering our
Yeah.
families? If we can do it without, the revenue is a positive benefit of it.
Yeah, and if she can handle it, more power to her.
I mean, this total figures in all the payroll pieces as well, so it helps to support people that are working in Powder that are all
Yeah.
residents of our district. too.
yep,
Yeah.
yep, so it's good.
So that's positive.
Yeah.
Now, we've never taken these to the full board, have we, Steve? We just kind of looked for feedback from the committee and then we've moved forward administratively.
That's correct.
Does the committee, that's what we did with Madison Country Day. Are you
Yeah,
comfortable with us
Yeah.
doing the
That's
same
fine.
here?
I'm fine with that.
All right.
It'll
Be
be
in the
in the
minutes, and
minutes.
if someone has a concern about it, it'll be brought up.
Hey.
Okay,
great.
that was all for tonight, unless anybody had anything else.
Do you have any agenda items for next time?
Yeah, so what we'll be bringing back next time is we will bring back the class size discussion with FT with additional data.
Yep,
But we will also be looking at the first draft of the budget. We will begin putting that together. In conjunction with that, Brian and I are going to be working on some salary and benefit information we bring back to the next HR committee. That's already scheduled for the first week in May. So we'll be scheduling, I would ask that the budget committee schedule a meeting in early May, next Monday night at the board meeting, a date that everybody
right.
can be okay with. And then we would be bringing that forward. We also bring forward the student fees for the next school year. We will bring a food service fund 50 budget for you to review. We do bring to the May board meeting insurance rates for health and dental. So really the May meetings begin the process of really putting, the details together for planning for 21-22.
Okay. Motion to adjourn?
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you,
Steve.
Diane.
Thanks, Diane.
Diane, appreciate everything, you guys.
Have a good night.
Thanks. Have a good night.
See you later.